Hello, YouTube family. Welcome to another episode of Anganta House German Shepherds. We're pleased to have a real pro with us tonight. His name is Vito Samba. The gentleman has a great deal of experience in the American Bulldog community and more recently in the Brazilian Bull community. Tonight's topic will be OFA and PennHIP hip X-rays. We're going to let Vito introduce himself, his social media posts in terms of Facebook, Twitter, and his website will be posted in the description. You can contact him if you're looking for a bulldog puppy, a very high quality bulldog puppy. And I'm going to let him introduce himself. Vito, how are you, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I saw you initially on the Joe and Dudley Connie Corso podcast. I know you've been a number of shows with him. You've discussed the American Bulldog and its evolution. You've discussed the Brazilian Bull evolution of that breed. And I know you're a big connoisseur of that breed. Why don't you give the audience a little background about yourself, your involvement with the Bulldog community, and how you became a breeder, and more about yourself.
Okay, I bred American Bulldogs since my first litter was 1994, and I got into it kind of weird. I used to be a big fanatic with Dobermans. The last Doberman I had some rare thing called diabetes insipidus, and I had to put him down by the time he was 3 years of age.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He had kidney failure.
Wow.
At that point, I was like, I don't want anything left. I don't want anything to do with Dobermans anymore. They broke my heart. And so I started thinking, I've been looking at these rare breeds. At the time, American Bulldogs were rare breeds. And I got one, not wanting to be a breeder. But then I got into breeding. I think I could make an impact in this breed. And then that was it. 30 some odd years later, here I am.
Right. Well, it's very nice to have you. I did a show not long ago called the AVK. It's a German word. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it. It stands for the ancestry loss coefficient. And that basically talks about how some breeds have exhausted the gene pool. And no matter which animal you touch in the gene pool, they're all carriers eventually. So even if you have another dog which is a carrier in your yard and you want to breed to a clear, the dog in the other yard you're hoping to be a clear is not a clear either, because you've exhausted your gene pool. And in some breeds, like the Doberman,
the Doberman,
we're reaching that point very quickly. And I am a pure breed advocate. I believe our pure breed should be preserved. I'm not a believer in mixing breeds, but I do believe there's an occasional need for a controlled outbreeding, maybe breeding the Doberman to the French Bisseron, perhaps. Just like we had with the Dalmatian, we introduced it back to the Pointer, which is where it came from, to solve kidney disease. And so it was not done by accident. It was done with the full knowledge of the AKC. It was not done behind their back. And they were told 5 generations later, by breeding back the pure Dobermans, the 5th generation can be registered as a pure Dalmatian. And I feel that some of our breeds have exhausted their gene pool. The ancestry loss coefficient, or the AVK, is 60%. For those who don't understand, 100% means you have no related ancestors in the past. So, for example, if you're 5 generations in, you have 64 dogs. And 64 out of 64 are unrelated. If you have 2 related out of 64, your ancestry loss coefficient is 62 out of 64, meaning nearly 100% is unrelated. If you have 50 out of 64, that's not good. That means 14 are related out of 64. So as the more inbreeding takes place, the lower the number as a percentage, meaning you're going from 100% completely unrelated to only 60 or less percent unrelated, which means 40. If 60% are unrelated, that means 40% are related. So instead of having, let's say, 1,024 ancestors in the 7th generation, out of that 1,000, you only your gene pool is really 190 instead of being 1,000. In other words, your gene pool comes down to a limited number of individuals as foundation dogs. And so as you exhaust your gene pool, your ability to avoid disease decreases because everybody's related to everybody else. Even if you have a low COI in that immediate family, in the 5-generation pedigree you're looking at, further back in time, everybody's still related heavily to everybody else, and eventually the breed loses the ability to breathe and create non-carriers. And so eventually you need to outbreed to preserve the genetic health of the breed, or you can't help but have disease, as Vito had with the Doberman, one of the breeds we're going through right now. I would say the British Bulldog is well past that stage and very severely parasitic breed with severe skin issues, severe breathing issues. It can't reproduce on its own without assistance from mankind, can whelp naturally. If an animal can't reproduce its own young and it requires assistance to have sex to produce itself, that animal would not survive in nature. So we need to look at that. And so the American Bulldog, in many respects, is an answer to that problem. Vito, can you talk a little bit about the Johnson type and the other type in the American Bulldog and what their differences are?
The American
Bulldog answers that problem with the British Bulldog?
Well, the American Bulldog came about kind of strange. The history isn't really concrete. You know, everything in the books or that you read on the internet gives a fantasized story of this is the original bull baiting dog from, medieval
Victorian era in England.
Yeah. So, but I mean, I'm sure that when the settlers came from England and Europe, they brought dogs, but I don't think it was, a big population. I mean, there is records of bulldogs being imported. I think the American Bulldog is kind of like a hillbilly bulldog that survived down south. It's been kind of a tradition. And when you ask old timers where they came from, they just say they've always been here. They've always been here, and they're kind of family bred dogs. And they were bred for purpose. And I think they came basically from in the 1700s and 1800s, a lot of bulldogs were coming in for work and for fighting dogs, from Ireland to England. And those breeders that breed those kind of dogs, they raise a bunch of them and then they test them, and only like 8 or 10% are worthy to be fighting dogs. The other ones just don't have it. And they usually call them, back then they probably called them, or they just gave them away to somebody as a pet, or if somebody had a pet back then, or to work on like a ranch or hunt with. Hunt wild boar, they came in handy, and even race, move cattle and all kinds of stuff they did. So, like if you look at the old Little Rascal show,
yeah, I remember that.
The pit bull,
yeah, with the eye like a circle.
Yeah, he looks more like some of the American bulldogs today than the pit bulls of today, and that's because the early dogs that came from England were big, white, piebald dogs. The dogs came from Ireland were a little more terrier, smaller, heavier color. And through evolution of the sport, or whatever you want to call it, the fighting, fraternity, the best fighting dogs or the gamest dogs emerged, and they weren't selected on looks. They weren't selected on anything but winning. So the breed changed a little bit. But those big dogs that weren't used, they weren't good enough or didn't have the drive or the gameness, those went to hillbillies and people, ranchers and farmers that wanted a working dog, and it just became a tradition. So different regions in the United States bred them different. So after World War II, John D. Johnson came back from the war, and he talked about they were almost extinct. So he set out to preserve the breed. Was
it a breed or a land race at that point?
It was probably like a land race or a purpose-bred dog. They probably nobody bred them that pure because back then you didn't have the internet, you didn't have transportation. you had to breed to somebody's local dog. Nobody's going to get in a covered wagon and go to New York to get a dog to breed. So they were just bred for purpose. So, and people, it became a tradition of having, some people wanted them really big, so they probably put something big in them. There's probably a lot of hunting dogs because they were used for boar hunting, for catch work. So a lot of, I deal with hog hunters now, and the way they breed is whatever works is what they breed. They don't care if 25.
So would you say there's overlap with what became the pit bull and Staffordshire Terrier in the beginning, or you think that there was maybe a foundation of similar dogs, but then it became a different breed and became purer and more refined as its own breed, as opposed to some different form of pit bull? Would you say that?
I think it went through a metamorphosis of who knows what they did, but what they did is they put a different selection pressure on. They weren't fighting them. They were using them as catch dogs. And a catch dog and a fighting dog, even though fighting dogs sometimes make good catch dogs, but to have a good catch dog, you don't want a pit bull temperament, typical fighting dog pit bull temperament, because they'd attack your bay dogs. Bay dogs are hounds that the hunters use
to flush the pig.
Yeah, they find the pig and they bay it. When they get to the pig, they don't really have the grit to jump on a pig, but they'll circle it, nip at its rear, and they keep it from moving. And then the hunter will come up with the bulldog on a tie out. That's
and dispatch it.
They used to call that the band dog, because it was what we call today a lead-in catch dog. You would lead it in, and when you saw the bay 50 feet away.
Hold on 1 second. So it doesn't, go ahead. I'm just turning it off so it doesn't ring by accident as we're talking. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Just turn it off in case it rings. We don't want this to ring while we're talking. So sorry. Okay.
So they let the bulldog, when they see the bay, they let the bulldog go. And a good catch dog, he'll run in with zero self-preservation, zero thought of anything. Because to catch a wild boar, you need to have zero hesitation. You hesitate, you're going to get slashed.
The tusks will kill.
Grab the hog by the jowl or grab him by the ear. And a good hog dog will stay sideways, right next to the hog, to keep from getting cut. Because hogs have real sharp teeth. Even if they don't have big tusks, if they have little ones, and they can sharpen them to be like a razor. They can smash somebody bad, really bad. That's why they put
these are very brave dogs with a lot of pain tolerance and a lot of aggression. But not dog to dog aggression, but dog on prey aggression.
Right. And a good catch dog is not like a fighting pit bull wants to fight and dominate. These want to catch and hold, because you can't, a dog cannot fight a 200-pound wild boar. They're going to die. So you want them to catch and hold. Once the bulldog catches, all the big dogs jump in and hold, and the hunter will come up and grab his back legs up so he can't run. And then they usually stab him in the side. It goes through the heart and lungs and kills him instantly. So that's the sport of hunting wild boar. And they want a dog that once the hog's dead, it turns off. So there's an off switch. He doesn't attack other dogs. And obviously, you don't want him to get aggressive and redirect a human. So it's a good catch dog.
It's a blood sport, but in a time when people had harder lives, because this is before the Industrial Revolution, before we had supermarkets, and you go to your local supermarket and you have bacon. No, you had to catch your bacon.
we owe our survival, on basically big catch dogs.
Right.
Running.
People are now so they hear these things and they're very shocked. But in reality, everybody's now against fur. Hunting, with fox's fur and wolf fur and badger fur. How do we think we made it the Ice Age? How do we had fur to keep us warm, or we would die of freezing weather? And people are now against all this, but really, you need that fight and strength and warrior spirit, or we wouldn't have survived. We've gotten soft as an educated society, but at an earlier time in history, we were not so soft. And the
Well,
dogs we kept were like us, tough dogs.
yeah. When you think back, when the cavemen or whoever
Right,
got a wolf cub,
right,
and wolves in a pack are a little different. They all have a different job. Some
right,
may be good herders. They're
right,
herding and running and
right.
catching up to the dog first. One of them is like a catch type dog, a heavier
Right.
wolf,
Turns around and
right? So they have
goes
different
for the throw.
skills. Yeah, a
Right.
pack is very different. They can't all be the alpha. They can't all
No.
be the bully. They
Well,
can't
that's
all,
why our border collies, if you look at how a border collie hunts, I've seen it in multiple videos, they stare down the sheep like a predator,
right,
stalking its prey. And it basically, we took the predatory response and we took out the last part, which was the kill.
right.
So we still see that. I'm drinking a little water.
Your breed, you're the German Shepherd. They evolved from herding, I guess.
Yeah, there were three types. There was the type, people don't understand where the German Shepherd came from. There was a type called the Thuringian type, which was North Germany. And there was two types in Southern and Western Germany. And Howard von Grafik, the first German Shepherd, was christened by the founder of the breed, Captain Max von Stefanitz, as the first German Shepherd. He had an SV1, Marie Schuffelhund #1. And so one of the qualities you look for as a breeder in German Shepherds is the grip, because they have to grip a sheep by the leg, not hurt the sheep, but grip and not release until it could be put back in the flock. And they herd in what's called the tending style, unlike the border collies, which herd in the eye style. In the tending style, you have two dogs walking like a living wall with a flock in between them. And if sheep gets out of the herd, the dog uses its shoulder and body to push it back in, and literally herds. I've seen some puppies try to herd me or my family. It's the herding instinct. It still comes back, and they try to check you with their shoulder, like I'm going to herd you back into the fold. So, and it's very. If you ever seen, I've seen. I participate in IGP, and I've seen bite work done by different breeds. And people think, well, bite work is bite work on a sleeve, and it's all the same. No, it's not. I've seen a Doberman do a bite sleeve. I've seen a Corso do a bite sleeve, and I've seen a German Shepherd do a bite sleeve, and they do it differently. The Shepherd bites and holds, and grip is genetic. They kind of want to hold the prey and catch the prey. If you see the Doberman, the word pincher means terrier in German. They are rapier. They grip, regrip, grip, regrip, grip, regrip. And then they shake the prey, and they grip and regrip. Now that's not correct for IGP, but it was not developed for the Doberman, it was developed for the Shepherd. So the idea, and they also bite with the front teeth, not the back of the mouth. So the pincher bites like a terrier. It bites, regrips, and they fight for the love of the kill, not the love of the grip. If you've seen a Corso or a big Rottweiler grip, they don't fight for possession of the herd like a Shepherd. They bite for the enjoyment of the fight. So the Gladiator breed, when you see it on the bite sleeve, I've seen they want to dominate the opponent. They fight for the joy of beating the guy. They're like, no, you're mine, baby. I'm going to beat you. And it's not about, it's very different how they bite.
I've competed with my dogs and like Iron Dog, and I was training for PSA with two of my dogs, but I never followed it all the way through with the obedience. But yeah, I have some of my American Bulldogs. I don't train them.
They enjoy the fight.
They love it. Like they love the fight.
They love the fight. They love the winning aspect of the fight. It's
people
the fight
watch
that excites. Yeah, it's the fight that excites them, not the grip.
Yeah, they think people watch it, think, oh, the dog's so vicious, but this is the fun zone. Like he loves a decoy. Like when he sees a decoy, he's so excited because that's fun. Yeah. It's totally in civil drive. It's not in. I mean, it's totally in civil drive, not civil.
The Gladiator breeds are all in defense. Like they're not really driven by prey drive. The Shepherd, you send them against somebody, and the man is running away, and that's prey drive. Prey's getting away, and so you can send the shepherd against the decoy, and that's it's catching its prey and happens to be the sleep. But what I mean is, how you teach bite work. People think, well, bite work is bite work. No, it's very different depending on the breed, and the original purpose of the breed comes through when you see bite work. It's if you're a student of breeds and you see, well, there's overlap because the sport is the same, but what the mechanics and how the dog engages comes from its genetics. It's very different to see a shepherd doing bite work versus a molosser type versus a terrier type. They're engaged and motivated by a different need in the fight. So you're right. There's definitely a difference in. I've seen a big difference in the American Bulldog. You don't see them very often in the sport of IDP. You normally see shepherds and Malinois, but when you see it, it's usually a good one, and the fighting spirit is what you see. That's what I see. So you're 100% right. Tell me a little bit about your involvement with the new American Bulldog or the modification of it, and the Brazilian Bulldog. What can you tell us?
Brazilian Bull is something just recently. I've never bred a litter yet, but I just have two girls I bought. A couple of years ago, I had somebody from Brazil contact me and say they wanted to buy an American Bulldog, that there's some in Brazil from me. And I'm like, no, that's not me. I've never sent a dog to Brazil. And they said, no, they came from Europe, from dogs you sent to Europe. And evidently in Brazil, what they did is they, South America, in Brazil specifically, there's a lot of young guys that do jujitsu, and evidently they work out on the beach, and they love pit bulls that are athletic.
Right.
So they imported these dogs. They're really not pit bulls. They call them red XL pit bulls, but they're pit bulls that were bred to be big and do weight pull mainly, stuff like that. Weight pull.
Are they the bully breed or still a pit bull breed? What are they?
It's a little different than an American bully, because American bullies originally came from UKC pit bulls bred to English bulldogs or mastiffs. I don't know. Everybody just falsified the pedigrees. Right. In Brazil, they specifically brought two lines that came from the red pit bulls. One of them I know for sure came from a guy that took an American Bulldog and bred it to a Dog de Bordeaux. This is big, huge dog called.
So loose skin and loose jowls.
Yeah, it kind of looked like a
very saliva-ish, a lot of saliva.
The cross looked kind of like a generic Mastiff with a black muzzle and a dark brindle. But there's a guy that was like the guru of weight pull in Oklahoma called Eddie Eddington. He took it. He just wanted dogs that he could compete in the higher weight classes, because pit bulls usually aren't bigger than 70 pounds.
No.
So he wanted the big weight classes. So he crossed that back to his weight pull pit bulls. And that's kind of where that genre of dogs came from. I don't know what other people did. I've heard there's a bloodline called Camelot that started kind of big. They're like 100-pound dogs. And I don't really know if that came from a similar kind of cross or how it is. But those are like big weight pull pit bulls. They don't have a pit bull temperament so much. They're probably a little more like an American Bulldog temperament. But well, those dogs went to Brazil. The guys did weight pull. They did that high jump, the wall climb, and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so I guess they started thinking, because here in the United States, they have the American bullies that come in the pockets. They have all these various sizes, and the big one is called an XL.
Right, that's what I understand, yeah.
Yeah, so they kind of started breeding those red XL pit bulls, kind of fit the same criteria as a XL American bully. But
they're not American bullies.
They did import some American bullies, but it's more recent. And then they used a dog that goes back to some of my blood that's an American Bulldog. There's a lady down there that's a big breeder called Sunshine Bulls. She had a big dog called New Iron. And that was a big cross, like him to those early dogs. In Brazil, originally they called them pit monsters.
Okay.
And they don't, from what I understand, in Portuguese or whatever, I guess they don't realize what pit, the connotation that it brings. It's just a name to them, pit monster. Pitbull, they think that the Pitbull is just an athletic, fun dog. So they kind of evolved that way. And the weird thing about them is something clicked. They probably have the most muscular skull and cheeks and craziest proportions. Like there was a dog.
Like double muscle, you mean?
It's almost like
a whippet, which is double muscle.
We wish they were double muscle. They're probably not double, but they're just heavy muscle. Like,
right.
It's typical. You can have a dog that's 24 or 23 inches and he's 150 pounds, and they're muscle, pretty tight skin and muscular.
Wow.
So they're kind of crazy.
Somebody looks like a bodybuilder for a dog.
Yeah, but a funny thing about I've studied the pedigrees. I'm not an expert on those, but I've tried to study it as much as I can to see how did this breed come about.
Right.
That's kind of how it came about. But the really progressive thing about the registry in Brazil, which is pretty interesting. I don't believe in just crossing dogs, but when you're starting a breed like the Doberman probably got hurt because there wasn't enough foundation breed in there, not enough genetics, and that's the thing when you're making a new breed, working type dogs, they may go 100 years and they're just purpose breeding, and the type emerges, and that by then there's huge communities that use them. It's a big, huge gene pool. Like I imagine the German Shepherd wasn't one guy. It wasn't.
No, it wasn't, because no one man realistically can create a breed. I mean, if you look at the history of the German Shepherd, or you look at the history of the Doberman, yes, Louis Doberman was the founder of the Doberman. For those who don't know, he was a tax collector, but he also ran a dog pound, and he had access to a lot of pure breeds in that dog pound. He was also a taxidermist.
He was a Rottweiler breeder. Of course,
the early Rottweilers and the early Dobermans were not that distinguishable.
Yeah. Early Dobermans were rough-looking dogs. They look real
terrible. No, they were not very.
They're not like as elegant and pretty. But what happened when I was a kid, I was big time into them in the 70s.
Right.
They got hijacked by the show crowd, and all these wealthy housewives and millionaires wanted these dogs because they treated them and bred them like they were Arabian horses.
Right.
You'd go to a show, and I remember seeing Dobermans in the 70s when I was a kid. And they had a thick neck. They kind of had a big mailbox head. I mean, they were like a bulldog, but they were compared to where they are now. And by the 80s, we had these little chicken neck, real frail, elegant looking Dobermans.
Well, the elegance came from the greyhound to some degree, that live, very athletic body. But I think you're right. I was a kid in the 70s too, and I was in high school in the 80s, and like my early days in college were the 80s too. And I think the Doberman from that time period, if you look at the early Dobermans, at least during my lifetime, they were used by the Marines, and they were used by the military. And they were top dogs. And everybody, when you saw an evil dog in the movies, it was usually a Doberman. And
the devil dog,
the devil dog was usually the Doberman.
My last Doberman, I used to walk down the street. People would cross the street, and he was a weenie. He wasn't a tough dog at all.
No, but that had that reputation. And so if you look at the dogs from the 70s, the Dobermans from the 70s, I'm not saying every dog out there, but as a general statement, they were a tougher dog than they are now. Same thing with the German Shepherd. In the 70s is when we saw the tremendous separation of the show line and the working line. I think, maybe I'm wrong, but there were two brothers named the Martin brothers. Had a kennel called the Wienerau Kennel and the Arminius Kennel. And so one was the SB judge and one was the breeder. And whoever bred to his brother's dogs, those pups from his brother's dogs being the sire, won the VA1, VA2 scores. And if you were from on the kennel, you did not place first for VA1 to 16. And then they were sold, this new fashion dog became popular and sold to Japan. or $100,000 in the 80s when a house was 45,000.
Oh, yeah.
Now we're used to seeing a car for 45,000. Back in the 80s, 45,000 was the cost of a house. You can buy a brand new Nissan Sentra. I don't know if you remember that commercial from Hyundai. $49.95. $49.95.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. People were buying two of them for $12,000.
Yeah, and a Ford Tempo was like $10,000.
Oh, yeah.
And a Ford Taurus, brand new, was $12,000. So
one of my good friends in high school, he
Yeah.
was like a late. His parents had him real late. He was the only boy, and
Right.
they had some money. So when he turned 16,
Right.
they took him to a Pontiac dealer and bought him a brand new Smokey and the Bandit Trans Am with every option.
Right.
And I remember thinking, we all were saying, "Oh my God, that thing was 10.5.
Right.
That car was $10,500, brand new."
Right. And I remember the IT car was not a Mercedes or a BMW or a European car. It was a Cadillac. Cadillac was like the shit. It was like the car in a brand new Cadillac Eldorado. I mean, sofa. Remember Ricardo Montalban?
Oh yeah,
That
Corinthian leather.
He would roll his R's. Corinthian leather. Remember? And it was the Chrysler Cordoba, which was a shitty car, but
Yeah.
but he
All
rolled
those
his
cars
R's.
were kind of junky
They
back
were
then.
junky cars. Yeah, they were smog so badly. Had an air smog. And
Oh
they
yeah,
were throttle body
if you got
injection.
100,000 miles, you were lucky.
Yeah, well, they were throttle body fuel injection. They were kind of a electronic version of carburetor. You might as well have them carbureted. They would have run better. But it was TBI, not TPI fuel injection. They were terrible cars. But there was like a Cadillac Eldorado was like the shit. That was $18,000 in 1987, 1985.
Yeah.
$18,000 for a car was like.
You could buy a nice house in the late 60s, probably for 20 grand, or
Right.
a house, I should say. It might not be the biggest house, but
Right. I mean, even up in the early 90s, you could buy a house for 130,000 in this part of the country. I don't know other parts of the country, but I mean, it's a different kind of inflation has taken away the value of money. But anyhow, I digress. I'm showing my age, but I can't help it. But remember Paul Volcker from President Reagan? Remember? So we inherited stagflation from President Carter. And normally, for those who don't know, I'll take a brief side tour and we'll go back to dogs. There was an economist named Jonathan Maynard Keynes, which was consulted by Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. And basically, he created a new way of banking because we had bank failures every 10, 15 years before him. Okay. And basically, it's called Keynesian economics. And we're still using this model today. Whenever you have inflation, you raise interest rates to make the cost of money more expensive to borrow, to cool the money supply. And whenever you have a depression or recession, you lower interest rates to make money easier to borrow, to increase the amount of currency in circulation. So too much currency in circulation, you have to cool the money supply. Not enough currency in circulation, you expand the money supply. So basically, the economy is a sine wave, it has ups and downs. You're trying to cut off the peaks and cut off the troughs, not to make the economy have too much of a wild swing. Well, this model of 1945 under Franklin Roosevelt, which he got us out of the Great Depression, using Keynesian economics and public works projects, but Keynesian economics ruled the day from the Great Depression up until President Carter in the 1970s. All of a sudden, we had the oil embargo from OPEC. Iran took our hostages in '79. Our embassy was taken. We could see our hostages paraded on TV. And it was a very sad time. The United States had its hostages taken by Iran. And he tried a rescue mission with a helicopter, and that helicopter lost its rear propeller, and it was an embarrassment to the United States not to be able to rescue its own hostages. So it's called stagflation. It was inflation and recession at the same time. So if you raise interest rates
are through the roof.
Right, through the roof. So if you raise interest rates, you're killing inflation, but you're increasing recession. If you lower interest rates to get rid of recession, well, you're increasing inflation. So what worked up until from 1939 until 1975, that Keynesian economics model worked. But all of a sudden, with stagflation, you had a mix of recession and inflation at the same time. Well, what did Paul? So in 1979, as you probably remember, Ronald Reagan won against President Carter. Later in
all
time,
the hostages came home all of a sudden.
yeah, all of a sudden, that was very interesting how that happened behind the scenes. Yeah, and if you remember Walter Fritz Mondale, who was the vice president of President Carter, ran against Reagan for re-election, and he said, "I'll raise your taxes." He was just being honest. He lost in a landslide. But Paul Volcker was the economist for Ronald Reagan. He raised interest rates sky high. Mortgages were 20% for a mortgage secured by, and he killed the economy, caused a recession. Everybody told Ronald Reagan, "What the hell are you doing, man?" With Paul Volcker, he says, "Don't worry." And Paul Volcker raised interest rates sky high, got rid of inflation, and we had a small recession, and then we bounced right back. So Paul Volcker was the, I think he was the head of the Treasury Department, or he was the head of the Federal Reserve. I don't remember. But
Reagan also, he said, deficit, schmeficit, and they just spent tons of money.
Yeah, it's called priming the pump. He injects liquidity into the market.
Right. He just wrote a check.
He wrote a check, and negative deficit, the hell with it. We're going to jump the economy, increase jobs, and then increase the tax base, and recoup the money by increasing taxes and everybody now working. Yeah, that's called.
Carter left office. I think the deficit was like $5 billion, and now it's 39 trillion.
Yes, that's right.
Things
Nobody even talks about a balanced budget anymore.
No.
The last guy talked about a balanced budget was Reagan, although Bill Clinton balanced the budget and created a surplus. So yeah, well, anyhow. Oh my God, you and I are the same generation. We remember, remember the same stuff.
I know. I'm the old guy that looks at a car and I'm like, $39,000 for that little tiny nothing?
Exactly how I think. I look at a car, I'm like, you must be kidding me. I
know.
don't buy new cars. I buy cars cash and I buy them used.
Me too. Yeah. I've never had a car payment for 20 years.
I'm tired of overpaying for what? Plastic. They're not even steel anymore. They're not even aluminum.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I have a little lawn business, and I thought, I'm going to get. I think I might get one of those big F-250s because you can write it off if it's over so much tonnage.
Right.
Oh my God! I looked at it. This is going to be $100,000
for a car. For a stupid truck. What I mean, it's crazy. Yeah.
I was like, there's no way.
Yeah, that's crazy. I remember you could get a Ford truck. It wasn't a luxury thing. It was just a truck. It was a work machine. It was like $14,000 in 1986.
Oh yeah, 1985. I think I bought a Toyota pickup, and it was $5,800 with air conditioning.
Yeah. We're dating ourselves. Anyhow, can't help it. Anyhow, let's go back to the main topic. Otherwise, we'll reminisce too much.
Yeah.
So, for the sake of the audience, the main topic we're going to discuss tonight, besides our memories of the 80s, is hip dysplasia, elbow dysplasia, and OFA versus PennHIP. Vito is an expert in this topic. I'm going to share my screen very quickly to educate the audience on the issue, and then we're going to turn it over to Vito to go into more detail, okay? I'm going to share my screen. So, 1 second, please, folks. Let me make sure I'm doing this right. Bear with me. If I'm not doing it right, let me know. And we'll do it again. No, not doing it right. Hold on. This is a little different from Teams and other programs. It's a little bit different. Just 1 second, guys. We got it. All right. Does everybody see this golden retriever on the OFA database? Everybody see that screen?
I see it.
All right. All right, guys. So this is the OFA.org, OFA.org. OFA stands for the Orthopedic Foundation of Animals. They've been around since 1966, so they are very, very reputable. One of the things you can do is if you have a breeder who says they test their dogs, you can click search OFA hip tested dogs. I'm going to type, for example, one of my dogs, just for the hell of it, to show you how you can look up a dog. And if a breeder claims to have hip tested dogs, right? Well, you either got to put in the DN number or the exact name of the dog. I'm going to put down the exact name of the dog. Click search. And there he is, born on Wall Street, the grandfather of my dogs. This is his AKC registration number. Gender is male, color black. This was the date of his birth. And you want to see his results, you download this CSV file. I'm going to open it. And you'll see he had excellent hips and elbows. I'm going to share this screen. Bear with me. And so I don't mind sharing this with the audience because I say I test my dogs. Well, if I was afraid of something, I wouldn't be able to share what I'm sharing, right? So, present. Make sure I put the right thing here. Stop screen and share this new screen. Share screen. Okay. Everybody see this screen with like a spreadsheet? Everybody see that?
I see it.
Yeah, it gives the dog registration number, and it gives the one row is the elbows and one row is the hips. So if you notice, it says his elbows are normal, and his hips are good. You see that right here? Hips, elbows. So if a breeder does OFA hips and elbows on their dogs, you can look them up think of it as a Carfax for dogs. Think of it as how would I go and check the veracity of what the breeder is telling me?
Kind of. It's a database for dogs that pass. But if
it doesn't pass, the breeder may not enter it. Yes, true.
Yeah, if they send it in and it doesn't pass, they won't put it on the database.
No, they won't.
If you go to the vet and you X-ray and it's obvious this dog's never going to pass, they won't. Right. You have to send it in.
No, they don't have.
That's one of the big differences too between OFA and PennHIP.
I agree, but for the benefit of I agree. It's a very good point. But for the benefit of the people who know anything about ethical breeding versus non-ethical breeding.
Oh yeah, it's a good way.
It's a good way to check the ethics of the breeder. They claim, well, they have this, they have that. Well, show me, right? Show me. And so you would go to this database, punch in the dog's info. Let me reshare that screen. Bear with me, guys. You have to share one screen at a time. It doesn't let you share it one shot. You have to like reshare. You're right. So you would click search and you would put in if the breeder shared it. If the dog had bad hips and they did it, they actually tested, it would not show. Or if he did elbows and they were okay, but the hips were not, he will show the elbow result but hide the hip result. But it is something to work with versus nothing. So it's better than nothing, and it is a tool for puppy buyers that they can leverage. Now, let me share the screen about what do these scores mean, and what is a bad-looking hip versus what is a good-looking hip. Let me find that screen to show you. Hip dysplasia. Now, the OFA does other diseases besides hips and elbows, but they're most known for hips and elbows. Can everybody see me scrolling this screen? Excellent hips, severe dysplasia, right? Everybody see this screen or no?
I can see it.
You can see it, okay. So let's take a look at what's called good hips. Notice the socket right here. Notice the pelvis of the dog. You see how much of the pelvis covers the head of the bone. You see the bone is deep into the socket, and the pelvis completely covers over the head of the bone. I don't know if you can see that. I wish I could expand it, but I'm not able to. So let's look at a fair hip. I wish you could see it magnified, but I can't magnify it. Notice the shallowness of the hip. See the ball joint of the hip, and you notice the socket. Notice there's a distance. You see the white light between the socket and the pelvis. See that distance between them? It's not all the way in. And notice how the socket, this part of the socket, doesn't fully cover the socket. It becomes more apparent when you see mild hip dysplasia. Notice the distance from the socket of the hip is further away from the pelvis. And notice how there's very little overlap between the pelvis and the socket of the bone. Let me see if I can make any of these bigger. So let's see if we can see. No, it doesn't expand. So this is in the case of severe dysplasia. Notice how little coverage there is by the socket over the pelvis. In other words, see the pelvis where it meets the socket of the hip. Notice there's very little overlap between the top of the pelvis and the top of the socket of the bone. You see that? But comparison, if you look at a good hips dog, there's a very good coverage by the socket compared to this. You see that? You see how much overlap is between the pelvis and the socket? There's a lot of overlap, right? Versus very little overlap. And another thing to look at, here's a case of severe dysplasia. Notice the distance between the socket and the pelvis. Look how far apart they are. You see that? And look how shallow the hip is compared to the socket. You see how poor the socket is? Let's see if we can see something magnified so we can really drill down into it. I'm trying to find a picture where they show it more magnified. I can't see anything more magnified than what those. So here's an example of excellent hips. You see the socket compared to the pelvis, how much tightness there is of the femur head into the pelvis. You see there's complete coverage of the femur head versus the pelvis. You see how tight that is? Notice the distance from the femur head into the pelvis. It's all the way in there. You see that? Nice and tight. Whereas if you look at, this is a picture of the tightness of the bone. This is a good picture. So this is the fovea capitis, the flattened hip ball joint right here. See where the ball joint is with respect to the pelvis socket? So this explains it a little more. I invite people to go to this website and look it up for themselves. But basically, I'm going to stop sharing. Basically, the goal, let me stop sharing, bear with me. How do I stop sharing? Let me see. Stop sharing. Okay, very good. All right, so I stopped the sharing, right? It should be no more sharing, right? So basically the idea is that here's your pelvis. You want the femur head to be all the way here, with this, the pelvis covering completely the head of the hip, versus if it's this way, it's shallow. You see where my fingers are with respect to the socket? You see that distance? Versus a good one will be like this. You see how much my fingers, which is pretending to be the pelvis, is covering the femur head. This is the femur head. Notice how much it's covering it versus like this. You see the distance? You see what I'm showing with my hand? Pretend this is the pelvis bone, and pretend this is the hip socket. So I'm showing the difference. Now, the torsional rigidity, torsion of the pelvis compared to the depth of the socket, is not shown in the OFA. Also, for those who don't know, in the SV, the Verisuchverhund, there's what's called A normal, A1 normal, and there's 5 X-ray views versus 3. In the OFA, there's only 3 radiological views taken. The dog is lying on its back, its rear paws are up. You technically don't need anesthesia, but usually you do. And so the dog is anesthetized, it's on its back, its legs are pulled up, which is an unnatural pose for the dog, and you're checking the firmness of the socket into the pelvis You're checking the laxity of the joint, essentially.
You mean in PennHIP? OFA, the dog's on his back and they pull his legs back as if
Right.
like he's walking straight up.
It's not, yeah, it's so there's 5 X-ray views versus 3 in the SB standard, but the idea is to check the amount of coverage of the hip versus the pelvis. Vito, can you, for the sake of the audience, explain what does the PennHIP score measure? What is the, now, before we talk about PennHIP, so there are 5 ratings in OFA. There's excellent, good, normal, fair, and severe. So excellent would be excellent hips. Good is still good enough for breeding. Fair is the lowest acceptable for breeding, but the partner dog must be above fair. So if, let's say your bitch is fair, the sire should be excellent. So you shouldn't breed a fair to a fair. You should breed a fair to an excellent. And then there's moderate dysplasia, and then there's severe dysplasia. So there's a 5 score rating. It's subjective. It's not, there's a 3-vet panel that is involved in measuring these terms. Can you explain, Vito, a little bit about the PennHIP, what the designations are in terms of the scores, and how it's different from OFA, and what are the benefits and drawbacks of PennHIP?
Yeah, I think first to draw the contrast between the two, because I think a lot of people just think it's the same thing. It's just a different company, but it's a totally different idea. It's a totally different science. Right. OFA is a confirmation subjective hip score. So they have 3 radiographic doctors that look at them and decide if they're excellent, good, fair, borderline, mildly, or severely dysplastic.
Right.
And another thing people need to know is dysplastic. Dysplasia, the definition of dysplasia is abnormal hip joint conformation. So what is normal hip joint conformation can vary a little bit from breed to breed, but from my research, and hips haven't been my major thing in the last 10 years, but there's never been a scientific peer-reviewed study that showed a correlation between hip joint conformation and the prediction of future hip problems. So what OFA does is they lay the dog on the back, they pull his legs, and that view is a really good view to look basically for calcification on the femur head or any kind of change, remodeling. Because when the dog's hip joint is, rubbing together, it wears off the enamel. And once you wear off that enamel, then it's a painful.
It's bone on bone, yeah.
So OFA is a subjective hip score, and they rate it on the hip joint conformation. So they're basing a lot of what they're scoring the dog on is the conformation, what they believe the physics of the dog's coverage of the femur head. But right. I'll tell you, running breeds, dogs that are running type dogs, sight hounds, German shepherds, dogs that are, border collies, are made to run a lot. They'll have a deeper socket, and they'll have a smaller bone, and it'll fit in better, obviously. But a big mastiff type dog may have a shallow hip socket and a bigger femur head. Right. It might not need it. But what PennHIP does is totally different. PennHIP had done research, and they've done clinical studies, and they've been peer reviewed, several. Matter of fact, the biggest ones I think early on were on German shepherds.
Yes, it was such a big problem, right?
They did it on German shepherds, probably the show line German shepherds.
The show lines specifically, yes.
The database. Well, what they did is if you look at a hip joint, the femur head and the acetabulum fit together, but in the middle of that, there's a flat spot on the top of the femur head, and it goes into the center of the hip socket. There's a tendon. Mm-hmm. And then the whole hip joint is wrapped in a capsule. It's a sealed capsule. All of your joints in your body have that. Now, when you crack your knuckles, what you're doing is you're cracking that seal. Mm-hmm. So that seal has to be sealed for them to rate it. And what they do is they do an OFA style. They'll pull them down, but they don't do it to judge the conformation. They do it to see any DJD, degenerative joint disease, or osteoarthritis, which is basically change, deterioration of the bone. Then they do two other X-rays. They do PennHIP is basically what they call a passive hip laxity test. So basically, the main thing is what they're doing is they're measuring the travel of the hip, that tendon, how far it comes out. And OFA says they rate distraction too, but the problem is when you flip a dog's legs down, that's not a natural stance. So it's going to pull a little different. It's not the way the hip joint. The hip joint is, this is the leg and this is the hip. They're not made to go like this. They're made to go like that. So this is really the coverage when it's in this position. But they don't even judge that. They judge the movement. So what they do is they push the hip joints in and they take an X-ray. And then they take this thing called the distractor. It looks like two rungs of a ladder, and it's adjust, and it's different sizes for different sized dogs because they want it to fit right about the size of the pelvis. And they'll fit it in between the dog's legs, and they raise the dog's legs like he's standing in a natural stance. That's why they call it passive hip joint, because he's in a passive stance. And then they apply pressure. Well, that distractor, that ladder, has foam on it. And because that's another thing, people are like, well, what if you get a vet that's crooked or he just doesn't apply pressure? So that foam in the X-ray, they can see if it's pushed in. It's got to be pushed in. There's got to be so much pressure put on the hip joint. And what that does is it pulls the hip joint out, and that tendon gets stretched to where it's at. Now, if they pull it too much, it breaks that seal, the nitrogen gets in there, and then they call it cavitation. With cavitation, they won't measure it because it won't give the right reading. So as long as it doesn't cavitate. So in the old days, they'd have an X-ray of it pushed in, and they'd have the X-ray of it distracted, and they'd lay them over and align the pelvis, and then they'd draw a line over the femur head when it's out and the femur head when it's in, and then they determine the center of it, and they have a measurement. It's actually measured with like a micrometer. It's very, very tight. A 1, if it goes all the way up to 1 means that the whole femur head is out of the socket. So it's out. And if it doesn't move that much, it might be, like sight hounds can have super tight hips that are like 0.1 or 0.09, which is crazy tight. I think the German Shepherd is probably they have what in the database, they come up with a median. So like in American Bulldogs, it was always like 0.54, 0.52. I think German Shepherd's a little bit better. I think they're like 0.48 or 0.4. That means out of the whole database, the median is that number. So they tell you if you're breeding the tight half, you're gonna do better. They don't tell you can't breed a dog that's a little looser, but that's just information that you could breed towards the tighter hips. Well, so they do that measurement, and then you get a measurement. When they did the studies, like I said, with German Shepherds, what they found is if your dog is 0.30 or tighter, the dog pretty much could live its whole life and not have DJD or wear on the hip joint. It's different for different breeds. Some little tiny dogs can go their whole life with pretty loose hips and not have problems, because it's like a sport. If you had a little sports car, you had a little Triumph Spitfire, and the ball joints are loose, you can probably get away with it. But if you have a Mack truck and the ball joints are loose and it's got a load in the back, you're in trouble. It's going to break. So the bigger dogs can't tolerate much laxity.
I think I wanted to, not to interrupt you, but I wanted to set some expectations for the audience, because we're getting pretty technical, but I wanted to explain some things to the audience. The first thing I want the audience to understand is that hip dysplasia is not completely genetic. And what I mean by that is that genetics has a component in hip dysplasia, but I write, for example, a puppy contract. And as part of my puppy contract, people get to return the puppy to me if it has bilateral hip dysplasia. So, for example, if a dog has a dysplasia in one hip, but not both hips, it's probably environmental, not genetic. On the other hand, if it has dysplasia in both hips, it is very likely genetic. So number one, I need people to understand that just because a dog has a score, it doesn't mean it'll be dysplastic. It means that you have to take it easy, not jump the dog from the back of a pickup truck. You have to kind of protect the dog's hips. And while a score indicates a direction, it is not a score is destiny. In other words, a score is predictive, but it doesn't mean it shows a tendency, but it's not a guaranteed outcome. In other words, if the mother dog has a fair hip score and the father dog has an excellent hip score, it does not mean that your puppy will be for sure dysplastic because one of the parents was not excellent to excellent. It's simply that you can't keep the dog overweight. You can't jump it at a young age. So I want people watching this broadcast to understand that there is value in these measurements because hip dysplasia was terrible in the German Shepherd in the 1970s and 1980s. Just terrible. Almost everybody had hip dysplasia. Ever since we started doing OFA hip X-rays and not breeding dogs which have low scores, the average toward good hips improved, and now the problem has been significantly fixed. In the Deutsche Democratic Republic in East Germany, back when East Germany existed, from 1945, the end of World War II, until 1989, they had a state-run program where dogs with dysplasia were completely culled out of the breeding program because since they were state-owned dogs for the military or the police, they could not use dogs which did not have a long life to serve the soldier or the policeman. So in East Germany, hip dysplasia in German Shepherd was almost completely eliminated out of the gene pool. Of course, that state-run breeding program is not run anymore because East Germany is not around anymore. But some people tell me I have an East German Shepherd. I said, really? From what kennel? Oh, it's a kennel which specializes in East Germans. I said, how can you have an East German dog with no East Germany around anymore?
Yeah.
I just laugh. People they got scammed because you can't have an East German dog and East Germany is gone, right? So, but anyhow, that's a whole different story. But
The European system is a little tiny bit different than OFA.
Could you go into that a little bit? That would be interesting for the audience. Yeah.
They use the Nuremberg angle, and that has a calculation is how deep how much it shows how much coverage it has and how deep it is. It might not look really deep, but there may be a lot. This socket may cover a lot and cover a lot of that femur head. Right. So they're a little bit different. And that's the thing. It's kind of OFA has a component of being a subjective score.
Right.
Because like it's looking at hips, they're all a little different, even in the same family. There's like it's looking at paint spots on the wall. Right. They may look identical, but they may be just slightly different. So
that's why the gold standard in the German Shepherd is SV certified hips. If you're getting a dog from Germany, imported from Germany, which has SV certified hips, that's the gold standard. They don't mess around. Yeah. I'm sorry, Vito, go ahead.
Germany and the Netherlands too, you have to realize too, they work the crap out of their dogs. Like, you drive around the United States and you'll see a soccer field or you'll see a ballpark or ball diamond.
Right.
They have Schützenfields all over.
That size, right.
It's like a big deal. And it's multi-generational families that they've done it. So it's almost like a national pastime in some ways.
Right. Yes, Americans, you have a hard time. I have to drive 2 hours to find a Schützen Club, whereas in Germany, it's almost every corner, practically speaking.
They have clubs too, and to belong to the club, you have to, everything has to be voted on or passed by certain people. Right. You don't have the freedom like you do in the United States to say, well, this dog has C hips or something, but gosh, it's such a good dog. You know.
Right. In Germany, you have what's called a core class dog. So in the United States, just for people who don't know, because not everybody watching this broadcast knows. So I'll explain. In Germany, you have what's called a breeding license to breed. That means for your German Shepherd to breed, it has to have at least a Schutzhund 1 on the male and female, which is now called IVP. Then it must do an AD. I forgot what the word means in German, but basically the dog runs next to a man on the bicycle for 10 kilometers. Then it's breed surveyed by a Kormeister or a breed warden. And typically the male is a Schutzhund 3 and the female is at least a Schutzhund 1. And after it's ADs and core class and Schutzhund title, only then they can breed. So they're very selective. Whereas in the United States, there is no such rules. If a male, if a female, if you want to breed them, there's no rule against it. Now, the better breeders follow the European standard, but you don't have to. American breeders don't have to follow the standard. But in Germany, you breed a German Shepherd, it better be breed surveyed, better be titled, and it's how the best dogs are produced.
Yeah, if you're not in the club, I think you could do what you want. But the problem is, in Germany, if you sell a puppy and that dog is dysplastic, has hip trouble,
right,
they can take you to court. And if you check the hips, you're not liable. But if you didn't check the hips, you're liable.
Right.
So that's a little bit of a difference too. But you know, PennHIP's been around a while, but it's so weird that it hasn't really caught on. I think it's because it's more expensive. There's more X-rays, and your dog, that's another thing, your dog has to be completely knocked out. Like you can't have any muscle pulling on the hips.
Right.
Because they're measuring laxity.
Right.
So they're measuring the passive hip laxity. And so every breed has its own database. So every breed has its own median so you can breed at the tighter half. You know, if you have a sighthound, they have super tight hips. You know, running type breeds, Malinois, those dogs, they have thinner bone, more of a running type dog. They have super tight hips. Mastiffs, the huge dogs, they can't tolerate a ton of laxity, but they can be a little bit looser. Tight. And like I said, little tiny dogs can tolerate a lot of laxity because
like a Dachshund, for example.
Yeah, there's not a lot of, it's just not a lot of mass putting a lot of pressure on the hip.
Right.
So and they're not pulling carts and not jumping over A-frames and
no, nothing like that. Well, you basically feel that PennHIP is the more scientific and better method. Is that what you're saying?
I think so, because I think that hip laxity, I don't think hip laxity is the only thing it's just the best predictor of future hip problems. There's been I guess about 20 years ago, maybe a little more than 20 years ago, Purina did a 14-year study, and they did a study, it was on Labradors, and it was basically the study was for, a study for a colony that's at a good weight and a colony that's heavier, and they had other nutritional things that they studied. But what they did was from the time the puppy was 4 months old, they PennHIP'd it. Because that's the nice thing about PennHIP is you can PennHIP a puppy at 4 months and 1 day. And because the research has shown that hip laxity stays fairly constant throughout the dog's life. There are false negatives and false positives, but it's pretty rare. So it might not have the exact same score every time you do it. I did it on a 4-month-old puppy. Then I did it on a year-old female. And then after I bred her, she was one of my foundation dogs. After she had 4 litters and she was 8 years old, I PennHIP'd her again. And her score at a year old was 2.836. And as a puppy, it was 2.736. And then as an older female, after 4 litters, she came back 3636, which they judge it, they rank it on the loosest score.
Right.
So she
and with the pelvis plus in the puppies widens the hips.
Yeah, you would think, running around being a dog, it's going to wear the hips.
Right.
I mean, it's normal. It's normal for humans,
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
But dogs that are 0.3 or tighter, don't usually have any any kind of DJD or osteoarthritis that shows up.
Why do you think, Vito, that for those who don't know, uh, you can only get OFA hip X-rays at 24 months of age? Anything before 24 months is called OFA preliminaries, but they don't count. But the official record is at 24 months. Now, I feel, this is my opinion, I want to ask you your opinion. I think it's done for two reasons at 24 months. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right, but I'll give you my opinion. I think the first reason it's done at 24 months is because if you're ethical, they don't want you to breed a 1-year-old dog. And so by forcing you to breed dogs after they've had their hips, and by making that age 24 months, they're forcing people not to breed too young. But then again, people who are unethical will breed too young without hips X-rays anyhow. So I think people who are going to breed just to breed, they're not going to necessarily do hip X-rays anyhow. But I think those people who do want to breed, it forces them to breed not too young. That's the first reason. The second reason, in my opinion, is that it takes a lot of work to title a dog to a Schutzhund 1 and even more work to title a dog to Schutzhund 3. It's like the master's degree in dog sport. I think that the reason you do it at 12 months is to see if the dog has bad hips and you're taking all that time and energy to title it, but you can never breed it. You don't want to spend time and effort titling a dog which can never be bred. So that's why I think they have this 12-month OFA prelim and a 24-month when it's official. It gives the breeder/trainer a chance to evaluate their hips prior to investing more time and effort into training the animal. On the other hand, PennHIP has no age requirement. Why do you think there's a difference in the two approaches of having a 12-month and a 24-month dates in OFA versus no particular dates in PennHIP? Why do you think there's a difference of approach?
In OFA, the older the dog is, the more accurate your evaluation is going to be. If you did an OFA on a 7-year-old dog, that carries a lot more weight than a 2-year-old dog, because a 2-year-old dog that has loose hips, it may have, a little bit looser than the median. It's probably not going to have any DJD at 24 months, but at 48 months or 50, 60 months, it may start to have some signs of it. That Purina study showed it, because what Purina did with those two colonies, at 4 months they started, then at a year they did it, and then at 2 years they did it, OFA and PennHIP. They every year they did an OFA and PennHIP on the dogs till they died. The oldest dog lived to be 14, so that's why it was a 14-year study. So what they found was that at 2 years of age, the dogs that passed, there were no excellence. There were only fair and good. The OFA dogs that passed fair or good, 55% of them went on to get some form of DJD or osteoarthritis. So
even though fair and good.
Yeah, they would still get the DJD and osteoarthritis. It may have happened at 11 years or 12 years or 13 years, which that's pretty good. The dog that age is probably going to have something.
But senior, right?
In PennHIP, the tighter the dog's hips, the longer time the dog went before it had any signs of DJD or hip dysplasia. So that's
why do you think these two particular ages? 1 second, please. I'm going to get some more water because my mouth is dry. I'll be right back.
No problem.
If you could answer for the audience, I'll be right back with some more soda. 1 second, please. 1 second.
Well, the OFA, like I said, they're looking at a subjective hip joint conformation, and that is their evaluation for future hip problems. PennHIP is only doing distraction index, a measurement of the looseness of the hip. So the research, the clinical studies that are peer-reviewed have shown that the tighter a dog's hips, the longer it can go without developing any problems with the hips. The dogs that are 0.30 or tighter, they can go their whole life and never have problems. My female I had a female Broadzilla that I did when she was 7. After 4, in her lifetime, she had 4 litters of puppies. She had no DJD. She had nothing, and her ranking was 0.36. And I had her grandson. His hips were 32-36, which are basically her hips. I did him at 7 years old also. Same thing. He came back 32-30 or 33-36. No DJD, no osteoarthritis. And like I was saying before, the definition of hip dysplasia.
Sorry, I have a bit of diabetes and I'm always thirsty, so forgive me.
No problem. I have diabetes too.
Yeah. Otherwise, I drink a lot, so I'm sorry.
The OFA is, the science is hip joint conformation. And then PennHIP is on the laxity of the hips. And like I said, the 14-year Purina study, you could probably find it. It was maybe 20-something years ago. They published it, and they found that, like I said, 55% of the dogs that passed that were certified, they were OFA fair or OFA good, went on to develop some form of osteoarthritis or hip degenerative joint disease, DJD. And that's the other thing that it gets confusing. Like the definition of hip dysplasia is an abnormal hip joint conformation. So when you say hip dysplasia, when you say dysplasia, you're just saying an abnormal hip joint conformation. But the research has shown dogs that maybe don't have the most beautiful, deepest hip joints, but have a tight, distraction index. They have tight hips. They can live their whole life and not have problems.
So you're saying the depth of the coverage is not as important as the amount of laxity of that tendon.
Right.
That seems to be more important than the amount of coverage.
Right. It's not common, but it is possible. It has happened that you could get an OFA excellent dog. An OFA excellent dog has the deepest hip socket, has the most congruent,
right. Smoothest surface of the.
There's no gap.
Right.
It's perfect.
Right.
So they've had those. It's not common, but they've had dogs that are OFA excellent. And because that tendon is loose, and you think about when a dog runs, if its hip joint is doing this as it's moving around, that's what causes the remolding, the osteoarthritis, and the DJD. If it's tight and it's got a deep hip joint, then that's fantastic because you have more coverage, there's more surface. Right. So that's the big thing. The big breakthrough with PennHIP was it goes against. It's a totally different. There's no correlation between an OFA excellent and a PennHIP score. There's no.
What year was the PennHIP invented? Do you know?
I think it was 90s. It was in Penn State. I forget the doctor.
A professor of some kind.
Yeah, he developed it at Penn State University, I believe.
Yeah, that's why it's called PennHIP from Penn State University.
Yeah.
I will say one thing very briefly, and that is, a lot of people are now eating raw diet, and all about raw. But it was a Purina, which is a kibble company. They also sell canned food that funded this study, which helped all dogs. So everybody crapping on kibble, well, crap on them all you want to, but if they didn't put up the money for this study, the PennHIP system wouldn't exist. So for all the complaints about kibble, there is some reason for complaint. I'm not saying there isn't, but without them, a lot of the studies we have, and not just on hips, other things, would have never been funded. So I just wanted to make a little, I'm not saying they're great, but I am saying kudos to them for funding these studies.
One of the things too you'd mentioned before, in PennHIP, you can get different laxity. One hip joint can be really tight, the other one can be terrible.
True.
And in the terrible one, it wears fast. It can wear out fast. And on the tighter one, it'll be So that's the thing. Sometimes you get them. Another thing too with PennHIP, you can even a dog that's 2 years old or a year and a half old, you can take it in and they'll do the whole spiel and they'll measure it, but they'll throw out the scores because the dog has osteoarthritis or degenerative joint disease already showing there's calcification. And that little bit of calcification will throw the numbers off completely. Because like I said, they put a circle over the femur head and measure the center of it out, and then they do it when it's pushed in, and then they measure the distance. So if this is remolded, then it throws everything off. So there's that PennHIP like in the forward, but they have DJD on both sides. Well, those scores are not valid because that number is wrong. The dog, if you did the dog younger, you probably before it had a chance to even wear, you probably find that dog was maybe 0.90, 0.10, very, very loose.
So Vito, what would you say to a potential puppy buyer where they're going shopping for a dog from a breeder which does OFA or PennHIP or maybe both, or that buyer goes to a breeder which does not do PennHIP or OFA? What would you say? Well, in other words, with all the criticism of these scores being not perfect or not equal per hip, and there's a difference in hips. I mean, a dog can have an excellent left hip and then not such a great right hip. We get that because that's biology. You know, not even human beings are not perfect left and right side of their body. There's a slight differences. But what would you say these tests show a potential buyer of a puppy if the breeder does these tests?
Either test is good. I mean, OFA is good. It's not, because if you don't X-ray, the thing that's going to produce problems for pet people, that dog and at 8 gets a little arthritic, and people are like, "Oh my gosh, that breeder screwed me." What the problem is that dog that by 2 years of age, he can't get up very easily, and then when he's 5, he can barely walk, or he can't even go outside to go poop. He falls over, and that OFA will catch that. Because that'll show up before 2 years of age or around 2 years of age. It'll show DJD. And, some dogs actually don't have hip sockets, or they have, it's obvious. It's not kind of like, you're not splitting hairs. It's obvious. Anybody can see it. This femur head looks square, and this thing is like this, and they're this far apart. That dog, if
terrible hips up front, right?
Even doing that, even doing the OFA, you won't know, yeah. And then if he uses a stud that's 12 or 18 months old,
your audio is lagging a little bit.
You don't have a chance yet to show. Oh,
your audio is lagging. No, it's you. It's the audio. I heard you, but it was laggy a little bit. But now it's fine.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me good now?
It's fine. It's fine now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you make a very valid point. What I wanted to tell people who are potential puppy buyers is that we can't perfectly predict everything in life, because when you're dealing with living things, you can't say, well, it's predicted for sure that the dog will have bad hips, or it's predicted for sure the dog will have excellent hips. But what I can tell you, I have a friend of mine. His name is Izzy. He's a trainer. Tied a lot of dogs in IGP. He's 75, 77. He has done it for 50 years. He, a few years ago, bought a dog from Hungary, from a kennel which was supposed to be excellent. And the dog had terrible hips, and he couldn't use the dog for breeding, and he couldn't have any recourse because the kennel was in Hungary. What is he going to fly over there and sue them? But it wound up costing him $4,500 to do hip surgery on that dog, or she was suffering in terrible pain, and she was a young dog. So it was bad from the genetic point of view, not because there was any injury to the dog. So for all the people watching this, what we're saying, to be clear, is that OFA and PennHIP have their differences, as Vito is explaining very, very well. Well, much better than I can explain it. But what I am saying is that a breeder who does these tests, whether OFA or PennHIP, at least they're doing their darndest to give you a good hips dog. Whereas if you go into a breeder which does no testing at all, you're taking your chances. So the odds are stacked in your favor if a breeder does OFA hip X-rays.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that's the point we're trying to make.
My,
Cost of hip surgery is very high.
my whole thing is, I'm thinking more like a breeder. You know, as a breeder, I used to get told all the time that hips are polygenetic. There's a lot of genes that influence it. There's a lot of different things because OFA was a little more limited for a breeder. You know, because what does a breeder want? What's the goal for a breeder is to produce a line that reproduces consistent. And
Correct.
You want to produce consistently great hips.
Correct.
And what I'm saying for breeders, the PennHIP, it's more expensive. It's a lot more expensive. Yeah. And you know, when I started in 1994, I paid $148 for a PennHIP. And now my buddy that's done a phone book of PennHIPs for me, he's retired and went to a different clinic. His good deal for me is $600. So that's a lot.
In your, what part of the country you're in?
And this is cheap. I've heard people say $800, $900, $1,200 for a
PennHIP. I'm in New Jersey, North Jersey, not far from New York City. You know what I pay for OFA hips? Never mind PennHIP. $850 with anesthesia, $250 for anesthesia, $600 for the X-rays.
Yeah.
And that's for, and PennHIP is another $250 above that.
Yeah, it's weird.
If you want 5 views for the SV, I sometimes get 5 views because I want my dogs registered in Germany, not just the US. I just imported a stud right out of Germany. I'm gonna, when it's in a time, I'm gonna have him with the German 5 X-ray view, not the 3 views from the OFA, which is the minimum required. I mean, he's under anyhow, so the vet might as well do 2 extra views. They charge nothing extra because the dog is asleep, so it costs them nothing extra to do an extra view. I found a doctor in Pennsylvania which charges a lot less. I'm going to give him a shout out; he deserves it. Dr. King in Pennsylvania. But you got to be there 8 sharp. And I mean on the dot. If you're 1 minute late, your appointment is canceled.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He's the German Shepherd guy.
A lot of
the German Shepherd people in my area go to him. He's the best. But
you know, that PennHIP, if I were into German Shepherds, because all the early studies I used to listen, it's all on German Shepherds, and it was interesting. This is the thing that the power of PennHIP is.
Right.
When you get a dog that's super tight, like 2s, 3s, and I think there's a lot of German Shepherds that have, especially working lines. I bet they're pretty tight.
Right. Working lines, yeah.
It debunks the whole idea that it's a polygenetic trait and it's not easy to line breed. And this hip distraction in dogs,
right,
is very, very genetic. Like,
which is why I line breed. Once I have a good hip dog, I want to lock that baby in.
Yeah, they did.
I want to lock that in, baby. I don't want to, lose it.
Well, they did a study. I remember it was a German Shepherd. They did experiment. Right. They did an experiment where they took a Borzoi, because like I said, a Borzoi, a sighthound, their median is like 0.20.
Wow.
They have some dogs that are 0.09. That's just crazy tight.
Right.
So they took a German Shepherd, bred it to a Borzoi, and then went back to German Shepherd and tried to keep those tight hips. But what they found was, if they found a male that was a tight PennHIP in the 2.7 or something like that, and then they bred him and they produced a daughter of his that was in the same type, same 2.8, 2.9s.
Right.
So he had her dad's hip laxity, and they inbred him to his daughter, and that worked way better. That really, and that's what I did.
From a hip point of view, yeah, but for me, I don't breed that type.
Yeah.
For a lot of other reasons, but I mean, as an experiment, yes. But as a
hips aren't the only thing to look at. There's a lot of other things, but what I did with I started early on, like the fifth, sixth dog that I PennHIP'd, she was really tight. And she was the first bully champion in the United States. And she was she wasn't a perfect dog, but she was exceptional in a lot of different ways. So I bred her to her nephews, 2 breedings to her nephews. Right. And then I bred her to an outcross male that was, I call it outcross, but she had common ancestors like the 5th and 6th generation.
Yeah, third cousins, basically.
Yeah. So and that one, and then I bred her, the last time I bred her to her double grandson. And
grandson, yeah.
Yeah, so it was like an inbreeding, but it was pushed back a little bit.
Right.
But his PennHIP score was 42, which is really kind of close to 36. It's about the same ballpark.
Right.
And that kind of locked in tight hips for me forever. Like even to this day, and I've had outcross because I've had other problems I've wanted to correct. And the American Bulldogs, the biggest problem is the breathing. The Johnson type, they have terrible breathing. A lot of them, because the trend has been to breed a big head, a short muzzle, an exaggerated dog.
What's the other type besides the Johnson type?
There's another type they call standard, or there's a guy that started with Mr. Johnson. He was a teenager at the time, called Alan Scott.
Oh, the Scott type.
His dogs, they call them standard. His dogs are probably more the traditional type. They look more houndy, pit bully looking, and they're more functional. Mr. Johnson, he had a quest to breed. He's said it many times in interviews, I want a bulldog big enough I can throw a saddle on him. So he had a dog he said was like 170. I don't know if he was that big.
Wow.
Because it
was probably a Mastiff cross of that size.
Well, yeah, there's speculation. He didn't ever fess up to it, but it's pretty obvious that he bred to a Saint Bernard.
Right.
Because there's several, even today, that line, 100% Johnson line, it produces dogs almost that look more like a Saint Bernard than an American.
Well, a Saint Bernard is a Mastiff. People forget that.
Oh, yeah, Alpine Mastiff. Yeah. They helped rebuild the English Mastiff after the war.
Well, a lot of breeds are no longer the original breed. I would call them resurrected breeds. An example of that would be the Dutch Shepherd. The Dutch Shepherd essentially died out at the end of World War II. And what you have in Holland is called the ex-Malinois. And sometimes they just call it the Dutch Shepherd. In the same litter. When you have the brindle-colored pups, they call them Dutch Shepherd. And you have the fawn-colored pups, they call them Malinois. And from the same 2 parents. And so there was a need to resurrect the blood and increase the gene pool size. So they bred based on performance in the sport of the KNPD, the Royal Dutch Police Dog Sport. It's very similar to the American PSA. It's not identical, but similar. But the dogs which were performing well were bred, not necessarily the dogs which were the purest blood. And so the FCI Malinois, FCI is the Frédéric Colomb International, which is the body that governs every AKC of the world. In other words, the RFK, the Russian Federation, the UKC, the British, the AKC. In other words, every country has its own version of the AKC by whatever name that is. And so the FCI is the parent organization of all the AKCs of the world. And so the FCI Malinois is the pure-blooded version, whereas the Dutch Malinois, it's not really a Malinois and it's not really a Dutch Shepherd. It's kind of a combo of both types. And also the Malinois is a very difficult breed to characterize because it's called the Belgian Malinois. And then you have the Dutch Shepherd. Well, Holland and Belgium were one country in the 19th century. It's called the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So where the border is, so over here you have France on the bottom, here's Belgium, and here's Holland right above it. So they speak Flemish, which is Dutch, and some of them speak French. So are they Dutch or are they French? So the Belgians are really unique because Belgium and Holland were one country in the 19th century. So I would argue the Belgian Malinois should really be called the Dutch Malinois. In my opinion, it's really the same bloodline.
I think that there was a guy I watched, some guy that was big into him, and this is years ago, and he was saying that the Malinois basically was just various shepherds and bred purely on performance.
Right. Original, yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. The best breeds in the world are developed that way. A huge wide spectrum of the same job, but many different people selecting and breeding.
You had a sheep herding dog which was effective in herding sheep in the tending style. You didn't have railroads, so you couldn't bring sheep to market with a railroad. So a farmer walked his sheep to market. He actually walked miles and miles and fed them on the go on the grasslands that he traversed. Well, one man and two dogs kept 400 sheep under control. If without the dogs, the man couldn't control 400 sheep. So dogs are responsible for our survival. I mean, going back to the earlier part of the show, we spoke about dogs helped us hunt wild boar, or we wouldn't have meat. Dogs has breed sheep to market, or we had nothing to sell in the form of wool and meat, and we couldn't feed our families. So the dog earned its keep by keeping us fed and putting some money down.
Very different than what modern breeders nowadays. Everything's about confirmation. There's a place close to you somewhere in New Jersey called the Seeing Eye Institute, and I spoke.
Yes.
There was a vet that ran that program. I think his name was Dr. Leitner.
Yes.
And I spoke to him. He was so nice. It was 25, 30 years ago. He took the time to speak to me on the phone. I was a 30-year-old kid. And he explained, he always used OFA, and then he pretty much switched over to PennHIP. But he basically, they breed Goldens, Labs, and Shepherds. Right. And basically, he told me that they produced a
in-house type,
a gene pool of German Shepherds that don't have hip. They've eliminated the hip problems in their little gene pool. And it's interesting. Like I never forget. Early on, as a breeder, you think you know everything, but you don't know very much.
Right.
He told me something. I thought, he's right. That's right. He said, you guys breeding for shows and all this stuff, you got so many criteria. He said, I don't have that many. The dog has to have the temperament and the ability to be a seeing eye dog, be trained. Right. It has to have a general health, and it has to have excellent hips. Right. He said if the ears are one ear's cattywampus, or the tail curls over the back, or it doesn't have the right color, doesn't have, those little cosmetic things. He said, I don't even look at that. I only look at the dog that fits those three criteria.
Right.
And I can't stop thinking, is dogs 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, people that use dogs for work, like that guy that you're saying that took a shepherd, this dog is with me walking across the country with 100 sheep.
Right.
I don't care what he looks like. If he's the ugliest thing on earth, I care only about how he works and how he
controls that herd of sheep.
So I think that's what we've lost in dog breeding.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I couldn't agree more. In fact, just as a side note, after World War I, we lost a lot of our soldier boys in World War I. We called it the last war to end all wars. Little do we know that 20 years later we would have World War II. But anyhow, that's a different conversation. So from 1914 to 1918, a lot of our soldier boys came back blind because in World War I we used mustard gas and poison gas and nerve gas, which was outlawed by the Geneva Convention, which was created after World War I. Lo and behold, we had mustard gas and poison gas in World War II. In fact, we still have mustard gas and poison gas today, but that's besides the point. Now, a lot of that, our soldiers were blinded by mustard gas, and so we needed dogs to walk the blind. So we imported German Shepherds from Germany, which was an enemy country, and a lot of people were resentful of Germany or anything having to do with Germany. So the British renamed the German Shepherd the Alsatian to get rid of the word German in the name, but it's to say it's the German Shepherd, and it was used by both the Allies and the Germans. But anyhow, the initial dogs, which were very good German Shepherds, but they couldn't walk the blind. But the three dogs which could make the training program and make the cut were then bred to each other, and instead of 3 out of 100 passing, but a 97% failure rate, every dog from those 3 dogs could now pass. And so the proclivity to train for a specific function is genetic. So a dog which is trained for bite sports is from a sub-gene pool for bite sports. A dog for walking the blind is for walking the blind. If you look at the Kirshenthal line by Mr. Carl Fuller, he's dead now, but he was a sheep herder, and dogs from his line at the HGH times, the herding times. Those German Shepherds from that line, not other lines, his line, could herd. And back to the history of the breed. Now, that line is pretty much gone now. With his death, his line has disappeared. I mean, they're now mixed in with the regular show lines. But when he was alive, the dog had to herd sheep or it wasn't good enough. It was sold as a pet and spayed. So the Kirshenthal line was known. So in other words, you're right. So there were some lines historically, like the Kirshenthal line, which was known for herding sheep. And there was a line for the Foundation for the Blind, which was good at walking a blind person. It's called willful disobedience. If a master asks the dog to walk into traffic and the car will kill him, the dog had to have enough intelligence to willfully disobey the owner and not allow the owner to walk into traffic. And that's called willful disobedience. It's a higher form of intelligence. Now, the Labradors they have, the Goldens they have, and the Shepherds they have, yes, they are still Shepherds and they're still Goldens, and they're still Labs, but they're from their own bloodline that they breed in-house for that task. And those are not regular German Shepherds. They are herding dogs for the blind German Shepherds. It's a specific gene pool. And people neglect how much genetics plays a role in animals. And it's all how you raise them and all in how you train them. No, it's not in all how you raise them. And it's not all in how you, it's a lot of it is genetics.
Genetic, yeah. Yeah. That guy, Leitner, or Dr. Lytton, I forget his name, but
Leichner, the German pronunciation.
He had an interesting program, and I thought, man, right. If I win the lottery, I'm going to do the same thing. They take whole litters. They PennHIP the whole litter.
Right.
And they take the scores and they average it out, and that gives that dog a HIP score breeding value.
Right.
It's not even that what his score is, it's what his whole litter averaged out.
Right. Well, the Germans do the same thing. It's called the ZW score. They average not only the dog in question, but the whole family. And you could have a great litter, but if that particular dog was, in other words, you're not passing the dog itself, you're passing the average of his family.
Yeah, I early on, when I was younger, I made a lot more money and I had more discretionary income, and PennHIPs were cheaper. Everything was cheap, a lot cheaper. And I did maybe 2 litters. I did the whole litter. But usually what I would do is I'd keep my 2 favorite pups and I'd PennHIP them at 4 months. And if they weren't good enough, they went to a pet home, if they were exceptional. And for a while there, I would not keep anything unless it was in the top 10%. I'd keep it in the top 20% if it was just had everything else.
So I use HIP X-rays for me as a way to know whether the dog should continue training or be sold. You use it as a way to know what to keep in your breeding program and whatnot.
Yeah, so I early on bred tight hips. I really selected for him line bred on tight hips. After starting about 15 years ago, I realized that hips weren't the problem. As a matter of fact, I had to replace dogs that they said had hip problems, and it turned out they didn't have hip problems. They tore their knee tendon. So now if I have somebody that says, "Hey, my dog, he's got bad hips. He's walking around with his leg. He won't put any weight on that leg," and I said, "Well, more than likely he tore his knee," which is another.
Well, don't they have to go to a vet before they return to? I mean, I have my contract. They have to go to the vet.
Yeah.
What they're saying.
When I was young, I was stupid. I got a guy that ripped me off in Puerto Rico. He had to have a translator, and I think it was all bullshit. He was just doing that to confuse me. But he sent me some X-rays, and like a dummy, just his vet X-rays. And I thought, I can't even tell what this is. I took it to my vet, and he goes, "What is this dog? Is all wound up. He's not even." And I don't think it was even that dog. I think they just did something because years later.
Some kind of picture.
Well, years later, I run across these pedigrees with my dog that was supposed to have bad hips. And I just knew, I should have known, I knew that dog did not have bad hips because I had her brother, and he was, my dog Broadzilla's hips, 3'5", 3'5".
Right.
So, it's possible.
You were scammed.
I was dumb. Yeah, I was dumb. Yeah. Now I require a PennHIP from anybody. But I haven't had anybody contact me that got a dog that says the dog has bad hips. It's only maybe like a knee tear on the knee, which I haven't figured out what to test for with that, really. I've had different answers.
So I require people to prove that they have bad hips before they get the puppy back.
As a breeder.
It has to be bilateral, not just one side. Yeah. Vito, do you have a website you can share?
I took my website down.
Oh, okay.
And
But you still breed though, right?
Yeah, Braveheart American Bulldogs. I'm on Facebook, Braveheart American Bulldogs.
Braveheart American Bulldogs. Okay.
Yeah, Braveheart. It's not.
Are you on any social media that you can mention, Twitter or anything like that?
I'm not on Twitter, but I'm on Instagram too. I think it's Braveheart Bulldogs there too. And with the Brazilian bulls, I just got into it, but I partnered up. That's where Samba, I partnered up with the lady I got my dog from. It's kind of an interesting thing for me because I've never been partners with anybody. But it's kind of we have a really cool group of, people. There's different.
If somebody wants to get an American Bulldog from you, they still can?
Yeah. I just had a litter. I hadn't had a litter for a year, and I just had a litter. They're like 3 weeks old.
Congratulations.
So,
yeah, I'm about to have a litter, so wish me luck. I hope everything turns out okay.
I've cut back, but I'm to the point now where I'm not. I've done, like I said, 15 years ago, I was hell bent on changing the genetics on my dogs because when I first started, I was like this, like the vet was saying they don't have that many criteria and they don't go by cosmetics. I was like everybody. I wanted a cool looking dog, and I made mistakes early on. I would pick a puppy that was, just had a beautiful head, beautiful neck, beautiful conformation, and maybe I would make excuses for its temperament. Whereas now I just can't stand a dumb dog or a dog that's
aggressive,
has a pet, silly, doesn't want to be with me, or it's just. Doesn't want to cooperate, or is too hyper, or is lazy, or whatever.
I think what we need to do, if you're up for it, is to do another show how you created a breed and what is the mechanism of how that works. Because you actually did create a breed, and we're not going to talk about it right now because we're coming up on time. But I think that we should do another show about, you're very knowledgeable, and I think we should do another show how a breed is created and what is the process. And I think we should do another show on that.
Yeah, I have some pretty crazy ideas now that I'm older about purebred dogs, not so much an established breed like a German Shepherd, but like these new breeds. This breed I'm starting with, these Brazilian bulls, it's a brand new breed. And there's little things that they're doing that are pretty progressive.
And I shape the breed in its early stages.
Yeah, because I think with a lot of these breeds like Care Lewis Doberman, I think they got popular and they shut the gene pool down without really a whole lot of genetics. And then they got popular and bred a bunch of dogs probably that didn't need to be bred. And the gene pool ran out. And so I think when you're starting,
you need to create depth in the pedigree and width, not just width.
Right. Yeah. I think the old ancient dogs breeds that were bred purely for work.
I think people in the old days had a better understanding of breeding than we do. We think we know about breeding, but we have modern knowledge. I don't think it replaces ancient knowledge. I think that there's a lot. Yeah. I think there's a lot to learn.
I used to talk to these old American Bulldog type of people, 80s and 90s, and I'd say, "You had these kind of dogs?" I said, "Yeah, we had them." He said, "They were smart. If they weren't smart, we didn't keep them. You didn't have to teach them very much." And he said, "Half the time we didn't have food. They'd go out and catch a rabbit or catch something and eat." They feed
Yeah, that's
themselves.
that's what I'm finding. I train, as you know, I compete in IGP. I train, and I find that a dog that comes from a good bloodline, half the work is done for you. The genetics
Oh,
are there that you can simply shape them and mold them, and the dog becomes a great IGP dog. Whereas if a dog comes from American pet lines, no matter how much you train it, it just doesn't have it in it.
oh yeah, it's heavily genetic.
It's
And
heavily genetic, not purely genetic, but heavily genetic. Yeah.
oh yeah, you can influence, you can socialize and train and influence. You can get a
Oh
puppy
yeah,
at 6 weeks and start imprinting quite a bit.
right.
But if it doesn't have it, it doesn't have it.
No, no.
And if you're competing at the top of the game, your
You
dog's
need
got
to
it.
have the genetics because you don't have time to waste with inferior genetics when the superior genetics will get you there faster.
Oh yeah.
So,
German Shepherds. When I was a kid, I was the kind of kid that was from the time I can remember. I've always been a dog nut. And my grandma used to live in the city, and sometimes my parents would drop us off there. So we'd walk through the alleyways. I used to like to walk through the alleyways and look at people's backyard and see what the dogs they have. And
they would
back then,
jump at the fence and bark at you probably.
oh yeah, yeah, we would run through there. There were cobblestone alleyways, and there was,
Right.
but we'd go to parks and things. And I always remember people had German Shepherds that were like street smart, super obedient, smart. And these aren't a Schutzen guy, a trainer. This is just a family that has a dog. They jump the fence and let you pet them and then jump back the fence, go back home. Or they walk down
Yeah,
the street.
the average was higher. The average was higher.
Yeah, they were athletic. They didn't have a sloping rear
I
end.
wish we could go back to those times as far as dogs. So,
Yeah.
but well, we're about to have another stagflation with the streets of Vamoose cut, and we're about to we're like the Gilded Age of the 1920s, and later the Great Depression at the end of 29. The 29 was the end of the 20s. We had
Yeah.
massive wealth and income inequality, and then we had the hardy tariffs, which were stopping exports and
Like every 20s, the 1820s, the 1920s.
1920s. And so we had, if you remember, The Great Gatsby, that book described that time period. Wine couldn't stop flowing. Champagne couldn't stop flowing. Money was
Kind of
flowing.
like it is now. We
Right.
have a lot
Until,
of lower middle
until-
class, poor
right.
people, and a few very, very extremely
we
crazy.
are no longer in we're an oligarchical society. Anyhow, I could talk in detail, but it's not the right format. So I have a good knowledge of history, and I think Marie Antoinette moments are going to come at some point. So, for those who know what that means, I think you know what I'm saying. Anyhow, Vito, so this was fantastic. I really enjoyed having you. I hope you enjoyed being here. I would look forward to having you again. I think we could talk at great length about dog breeding and restoring our great heritage breeds to their former glory. I think we could talk about how to make a new breed and what goes into it. You're a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of information. Thank you for taking your time to talk about orthopedics. I think the audience is more enlightened than ever before, and I really thank you. And you've added to the depth of the conversation. You elevate the quality of the conversation on dogs, and I think the dog community benefits from ambassadors like you, which have been ambassadors and stewards of the breed. And I think you are always welcome on this show, and I would love to have you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.